For 200 years, history told one story, until DNA uncovered a signal so old it shattered the official timeline of the American frontier. Today, you are going to learn 3 things you were never taught. First, how a single Y chromosome marker, carried by millions of Americans of Scots-Irish descent, appears in places it should never be. Old places it should not have reached for at least another 400 years. Second, why a 2014 follow-up study, coordinated through researchers at the University of Leicester, found that the genetic profile of certain Appalachian families does not match the migration records that supposedly brought their ancestors to those mountains. The study was published, then quietly it was pulled. Third, what your own ancestry test almost certainly hides if your family came through the Cumberland Gap, the Shenandoah Valley, or the Carolina back country before 1800. This is the story of how the population we call the Scots-Irish became the genetic foundation of the United States, and how the DNA they left behind contains a contradiction no historian has been able to explain. To understand what was found, you have to understand who these people were, because what you were taught in school is, at best, only half of the answer. In the year 1610, King James I of England started what was at the time the most ambitious population move in European history. He took lowland Scots, the descendants of border raiders and Calvinist farmers from the moors of Galloway and Dumfries, and he moved about 50,000 of them across the Irish Sea into the province of Ulster. The plan was simple: settle Protestants on Catholic land, tie the British crown to Ireland, crush rebellion through population change. The Scots took the land. They built towns: Belfast, Londonderry, Charlemont, Carrickfergus. They farmed flax. They wove linen. They prayed in plain Presbyterian meeting houses. And they fought constantly and without mercy with the Catholic Irish, whose land they had taken. For 107 years they grew, and then, starting in 1717, they began to leave. Between 1717 and 1775, somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000, Scots-Irish boarded ships in Belfast and Larne and Londonderry, sailed across the Atlantic and landed in colonial Pennsylvania. From there they walked south down the Great Wagon Road into Virginia, into the Carolinas, and finally over the Blue Ridge into the dark valleys of Tennessee and Kentucky. They settled the frontier. They cleared the forests. They built the log cabins that became the visual sign of America itself. And the names you know from American history, the men whose faces are on your money and whose statues stand in your courthouse squares, came from these people: Andrew Jackson, Davy Crockett, Sam Houston, James K. Polk, Daniel Boone, the mountain ancestors of Theodore Roosevelt. Even Mark Twain's family line traced back through Tennessee, through Virginia, through Pennsylvania, and finally back to the linen-weaving towns of County Antrim. By the first United States Census in 1790, the Scots-Irish were the third largest founding population in the new country, larger than the Dutch, larger than the Quakers, and in some states, larger than the English themselves. That is the story you were taught. What you were never taught is what was found 3 centuries later in their bones. In 2003, a researcher named Doug MacDonald, working out of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, began running deep ancestry tests on volunteers from across the eastern United States. MacDonald was a chemist by training, but he had built a tool that could break the human genome into thousands of population-specific markers. Give him a saliva sample, and he could tell you with uncomfortable precision where your ancestors had stood 500 years ago. MacDonald began collecting samples from Appalachia. What he found at first was not surprising. Most of his subjects came back as mostly British and Irish. expected mix, some German Palatine, a trace of Welsh, the occasional Huguenot. French, standard frontier genetics. But a small percentage of his Appalachian samples showed something else, something that, by every official record of who had walked into those mountains, should not have been there. Buried inside the genome of certain old families was a signal, faint but clear. The markers were not Scottish. They were not Irish. They were not Northern European in any clear sense. And the genetic clock that geneticists use to date such markers place their entry into the population far, far earlier than any Scots-Irish ship had ever crossed the Atlantic. MacDonald marked it. He ran the samples again. He ran them a third time. Result did not change. He published a short technical note. Almost no one read it. We will come back to what those markers actually were. But before we get there, you need to understand what happened 9 years later when a different researcher working a few hundred miles to the south accidentally confirmed what MacDonald had found. In 2012, a researcher named Roberta Estes published a study in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy. The subject of the study was a population that lived in the same hills MacDonald had been sampling, a population that, until very recently, most Americans pretended did not exist. They called themselves the Melungeons. For 3 centuries, the Melungeons of East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, and Eastern Kentucky had told their neighbors a story. They were not white. They were not black. They were not Indian. They were, they said, descended from a lost people. Some claimed Portuguese sailors, shipwrecked centuries before any English ship reached Jamestown. Some claimed Phoenicians. Some claimed Roma. The official records, when records existed at all, listed them as free people of color, a label that in the antebellum South took away almost every legal right they had. For 150 years, scholars dismissed the Melungeon origin stories as folklore, romantic invention, the kind of story a pushed aside people tells itself to explain why it does not fit. Then Estes published her DNA results, and the world the historians had built collapsed. The Melungeons were not lying. They were not Portuguese. They were not Phoenician, but they were not, in any clean sense, white or black or Native American either. Their DNA showed strong sub-Saharan African ancestry on the male line mixed with Northern European ancestry on the female line mixed with something else. A third signal Estes could not at first identify. And here is the part that stunned the small group of researchers who actually read the paper. That third signal appeared in the same Appalachian families Doug MacDonald had marked 9 years earlier. 2 researchers, 2 completely different methods, 2 decades apart, the same anomaly in the same hollows of East Tennessee. But this is where the story stops being a curiosity and starts being a problem, because the official record is clear. White settlers entered Appalachia in large numbers no earlier than the 1740s. Before that, the mountains were Cherokee territory, fought over with the Shawnee and the Yuchi, and completely closed to European settlement. Anyone who tried to cross the Blue Ridge before then was either killed, captured, or turned back at gunpoint. So whatever the Scots-Irish brought with them genetically, they brought it in the 18th century, after 1740, not before. The markers MacDonald and Estes had marked did not match this timeline. They were older. When geneticists study inherited DNA, certain mutations work like biological clocks. The Y chromosome gathers errors at a known and measurable rate. By counting the differences between 2 men carrying the same broad lineage, you can guess how long ago their most recent common ancestor lived. Apply this clock to the Appalachian samples. Apply it to the strange third signal in the Melungeon DNA. The answer that comes back is not 300 years. It is closer to 1,000. In 2014, a research group with ties to the University of Leicester ran a much larger comparison. They had access to a database of British and Irish DNA samples covering nearly every county in the British Isles. They compared this database to several hundred self-identified Scots-Irish Americans drawn from across the upland south. The match should have been simple. Take the Ulster Scots in Tennessee, match them to the Lowland Scots in Galloway and Ayrshire, confirm the migration, publish, move on. The match was not simple. About 12% of the American samples carried a Y chromosome lineage that did not appear in meaningful numbers anywhere in modern lowland Scotland. It did not appear in Ulster. It did not appear in northern England. It appeared faintly in only two places. The first was a cluster of villages on the western coast of Ireland, Old Gaelic stock untouched by the plantation. The second was a population in the Outer Hebrides, the wind-beaten islands off the Scottish coast, whose ancestors had been Norse Gael for over 1,000 years. In other words, the marker that 1 in 8 Scots-Irish Americans carried was older than the plantation, older than the migration to America, older, in some cases, than the Kingdom of England itself. It was a signal from a deeper past, and nobody could explain how it had ended up in the hollows of East Tennessee. The 2014 paper was published in a small journal. It was almost never cited. Within 5 years, it had been quietly retracted, with the author's citing method problems. The dataset was never released to the broader scientific community, but the data had already been seen, and by the time it was pulled, the question it raised had already started to spread. Geneticists call it R1b L21. Among genealogists, it is sometimes called the Atlantic modal haplotype. It is the marker carried by about 70% of Western European men, with peaks in Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and Brittany. Within R1b L21, there is a branch called R1b M222, sometimes nicknamed the Kneel of the Nine Hostages marker, after a 5th century Irish king from whom millions of modern Irish men claim descent. These are the markers you would expect to find in Scots-Irish Americans, and you do find them in large numbers. But under the M222 layer, under the layer that arrived in Pennsylvania around 1730 and walked south to Tennessee, there is something else. A deeper layer, a signal. The genetic clock dates it not to the 18th century, not even to the medieval period, but to about the year 1000 of the Common Era. Give or take 100 years. 1,000 years ago, no European had any business being in Appalachia officially, but the year 1000 is also, by the most generous reading of the archaeological evidence, the moment Norse explorers built a settlement at Lance aux Meadows in what is now Newfoundland. The Vinland sagas describe trips south. The Norse called the lands they explored Markland and Vinland. Where exactly those names pointed, no archaeologist has confirmed. They may have reached as far as the Gulf of Maine. They may have reached farther. What we know is this. Around the year 1000, Norse longships were active in the western Atlantic. Around that same window, a genetic signal entered a population that would eventually appear 1,000 years later in the bones of East Tennessee. Historians have an explanation of course, statistical noise, sample contamination, mutation rate, uncertainty, coincidence. But the families who carry the marker have a different explanation, and it is the same explanation their grandmothers told them 100 years before any DNA test existed. If you grew up in Appalachia, you have probably heard the phrase Black Dutch or Black Irish, or in the older families, simply this: we were here before. For generations, families in the southern mountains have told their children that their bloodline is older than the country they live in. That's somewhere in the deep past, before the plantation, before Ulster, before even the medieval kings of Scotland. A sailor or a wanderer crossed an ocean and never went home. Folklore, historians said, romantic invention, frontier myth. The DNA does not lie, and the DNA suggests, quietly and without apology, that the grandmothers may have been telling a truer story than the Academy ever wanted to admit. This is the point in the story where I have to be careful with you, because I am not telling you that the Vikings settled Tennessee. I am not telling you there is a lost Norse colony buried under the Smoky Mountains. The data does not support that. Not yet. What the data supports is something stranger and more interesting. It supports the idea that the population we now call the Scots-Irish was already, before they boarded a single ship for America, a deeply layered, deeply mixed people. The plantation of Ulster did not just settle Scots in Ireland. It settled people whose ancestors had been moving through the British Isles for 1,000 years, picking up genetic signals from Norse raiders, from old Irish kingdoms, from Picts and Scots, and the strange, forgotten populations that were already there before recorded history began. When those people boarded ships in Belfast in 1717, they brought all of that with them, and they planted all of it in the American mountains, which means the bloodline of the American frontier is not what you were told it was. It is older. It is stranger. And in the hollows of Appalachia, in the families who never moved, who married their cousins for 10 generations and locked the deeper signal in place, that older story is still readable in the genome, if you know how to look. If your ancestors arrived in America before 1700, and especially if they arrived between 1717 and 1775, through the Pennsylvania port of Philadelphia, walked south through the Great Wagon Road, and settled anywhere from western Maryland down through the Carolinas and into the mountains south, you almost certainly carry this signal. You probably do not know it because most consumer DNA tests, the kind sold by the major commercial companies you have seen advertised on television, are not designed to detect lineages this old. They will tell you that you are 38% Scottish, 22% Irish, 17% English, and the rest a comfortable mix of broad Western European categories. Their results are designed to make sense, to produce a clean, marketable pie chart. The deeper signal, the one that does not fit the chart, sits below their resolution. It is there. The companies simply do not look for it, and in some cases, when their internal programs encounter it, they round it off into the nearest familiar category. But it is there, and in about 1 in 8 people of Scots-Irish descent, it is clear when the right test is run, which raises an uncomfortable question. If 12% of the men whose ancestors built the American frontier carry a genetic marker older than Ulster, older than the plantation, older than any official record of European presence in their family line, then what does it really mean to call them Scots-Irish? In the first place, what is it that we have really been calling Scots-Irish for the last 300 years? And how much of the official story of how America was peopled, the textbook story, the story that begins at Plymouth Rock in Jamestown and ends in the Cumberland Gap, is built on a foundation the DNA quietly refuses to support? If you have ever taken one of those commercial tests and the result felt a little incomplete, like the chart was telling you part of an answer but not the whole one, this is why. The whole answer is older than the test was built to find. There is a term geneticists use very quietly in the technical literature. They call them the Atlantic founders, a population, or rather a layered series of populations that moved up and down the western edge of Europe for thousands of years, mixing, splitting, sailing, vanishing, coming back. The Bell Beaker peoples of the Bronze Age, the Norse Gael of the medieval Hebrides, the Gallowglass, mercenaries who sold their swords from Ireland to Scotland and back. Again, the forgotten clans of the Outer Isles whose names never made it into any English document. By the time these people reached the shores of Ulster in the 17th century, they were not one single people. They were a sediment, layer upon layer of every population that had ever touched the Irish Sea. When they crossed the Atlantic, they crossed it as carriers of a deeper European past than any of them knew about. They were the last living expression of a North Atlantic genetic system that reached, at its height, from Brittany to Iceland to possibly the eastern coast of North America 500 years before Columbus. We never learned that name in school. The Atlantic founders, the men and women whose blood mixed and mixed again and carried west on weather-beaten ships, became the genetic floor of half of America. We were taught about pilgrims. We were taught about cavaliers. We were taught about plantation gentry and Quaker merchants and the polite founding of the eastern seaboard. We were taught the story of the coast, the official story, the story of the West, of the mountains, of the people who came through Philadelphia with nothing and walked 1,000 miles into the wilderness with a Bible and a long rifle, and a bloodline they could not name. That story was never written into the textbooks. It was written instead into the genome, where it has waited quietly in the bones of small mountain churchyards and in the saliva tubes of millions of unsuspecting Americans for the technology to catch up and read it. In the next installment of this series, we are going to look at what the DNA reveals about the second great founding population of the American interior, the borderers, the men and women of the English-Scottish frontier, the reavers, the people who, when they reached America, did not settle on the coast or the Piedmont, but pushed past every other group all the way to the deepest hollows of Appalachia and stayed there for 10 generations without moving. Their story is darker than the Scots-Irish story. Their bloodline is older, and the markers they carry connect through a chain of evidence that took 30 years to build. To a population the historians of the 19th century spent their whole careers pretending had been wiped out. It had not been wiped out. It had simply stopped speaking its